Chloe Martinez had been counting down the days for this trip. For weeks, her social media had been filled with packing videos, outfit tours, and playful reminders to her followers that she'd be going off-grid, but not really. At 25, Chloe was the kind of rising OnlyFans model whose success had been built as much on personality as on looks. She wasn't just a face or a body on a screen, she was an online persona, candid and interactive, the type who answered DMs from fans, shared raw life updates, and laughed at her own embarrassing stories. This cruise was supposed to be her celebration, a week-long escape with two of her closest friends, her way of unwinding after a year of grinding for content and saving enough to finally travel like she'd always dreamed. It wasn't just a trip. It was a statement. She was making it. Her first posts from the ship felt like exactly what anyone would expect from a Caribbean cruise influencer getaway. Panoramic shots of the endless blue ocean, her posing in a bright orange bikini on the deck, glasses of champagne in hand with her friends, late-night buffet runs, and cheeky videos of them dancing by the pool as a live band played steel drums. Each post had that curated but casual energy her audience loved, with little captions like, "Can someone remind me why I ever lived anywhere but the ocean? And I think I was born for this." To her hundreds of thousands of followers, it looked like Chloe was exactly where she wanted to be. To her friends, who were there with her, it seemed the same. But Chloe's closest confidants later told investigators that she'd been off the first 2 days, still cheerful, still laughing, but distracted. Checking her phone more than usual. Glancing over her shoulder in crowded spaces. Brushing off questions with jokes when they asked if something was wrong. On the night of January 18th, her posts took a different tone. She shared fewer photos that evening, no lengthy captions, and no playful back and forths with fans in her comments. At 11:47 p.m., she posted a single shot, her cocktail sitting alone on the edge of a bar, captioned with a single word, recharge. It didn't get the same excited tone her followers were used to. At 12:25 a.m., her friend tagged her in a group photo from the ship's nightclub, but Chloe didn't share it to her own story. Then, at 1:13 a.m., her final Instagram story went live, a video clip of her laughing in the pulsing strobe lights of the club, surrounded by strangers and acquaintances in various stages of drunkenness. She's holding her phone in one hand, the camera angled clumsily, as if she wasn't really paying attention to what she was recording. A flash of someone else's face appears over her shoulder, a man, blurry and unidentifiable, leaning close enough to be in her space. The clip ends abruptly. By 8 a.m., Chloe's friends were waiting for her at breakfast. She didn't show. At first, they chalked it up to her sleeping off a late night. But by 10 a.m., she still hadn't answered texts or opened her cabin door. By 11, they were trying her room phone, knocking again, and messaging her repeatedly across every app she used. Nothing. When noon rolled around and she missed a pre-booked spa appointment she'd been excited about for days, her friend's concern hardened into fear. Chloe wasn't someone who disappeared from plans, especially ones she'd paid for in advance. One of her friends later described those hours as surreal. They kept expecting her to pop up, to stumble out of a room with an apologetic smile, to text back something casual like, "Just slept in." But she never did. They finally went to the crew, reporting her missing. It was dismissed at first. "She's probably just hungover," one staff member said. But her friends insisted. She hadn't returned to the room. She hadn't been seen since the nightclub. And then came the most unsettling discovery. When the staff checked her onboard account, there had been no activity, no room key usage, no purchases, no signs, since just after 1:30 a.m. Her friends pulled up a Find My Phone app they'd often used for fun to track each other on nights out. Chloe's phone showed its last activity at exactly 1:32 a.m., and then nothing. The signal went dark, as if it had been switched off or gone into a place with no connection. That timestamp haunted everyone who saw it. It was precise, final. What happened to her in those 19 minutes between posting that video and the phone going silent? Staff initiated a casual search, checking common areas and her cabin, but they didn't escalate immediately. It wasn't until later, when Chloe's friends insisted something was deeply wrong, that the reality set in. A young woman was missing on a ship hundreds of miles from shore, last seen in the middle of the night, with her phone mysteriously going offline minutes later. It didn't feel like someone sleeping in. It felt like she'd vanished. And that's when another detail began to gnaw at everyone, passengers and staff alike. Chloe's last story wasn't just a typical nightclub clip. It ended abruptly, mid-laugh, like she'd been interrupted. And the man in the background, the one leaning into her space? None of her friends knew who he was. When the video was paused at the right frame, his blurred face seemed locked on her, too close, too intentional to be random. As the hours stretched with no word from Chloe, that final video stopped feeling like a party moment. It started to feel like a warning.
By noon, the buzz of excitement that had filled the massive ship had shifted to an undercurrent of unease. Chloe's friends, no longer able to convince themselves that she had just overslept, stood at the guest services desk, voices shaking as they explained to the crew that their friend hadn't returned to her cabin, hadn't answered any calls or messages, and had now been missing for nearly 12 hours. At first, the response was procedural. a note taken, a few radio calls made, but when the staff realized Chloe's keycard hadn't been used since just after 1 in the morning, their demeanor changed. Within minutes, a chain of communication was triggered that moved beyond basic customer service. Her name was reported to ship security, and the captain was notified. This wasn't a case of a passenger choosing to be left alone. This was something else entirely. The crew initiated what they called a confined search. Staff were deployed to comb the ship, floor by floor, beginning with the common areas and expanding to the restaurants, hallways, and lounges. Crew members checked every women's bathroom, every quiet corner where a hungover passenger might be sleeping off a rough night. They checked the fitness center, the spa, and even the infirmary, though no one had been admitted there overnight. By mid-afternoon, the search expanded. Restricted decks used only by staff were inspected, kitchen staff were questioned, and housekeeping teams were directed to knock on every cabin door. Some passengers were startled awake by the intrusion. Others willingly opened their rooms to allow staff a quick glance inside. But even after hours of this all-hands effort, there was no sign of Chloe. It was as though she had simply vanished between 1 in the morning and dawn. At 2:15 p.m., the captain ordered an emergency head count, one step short of a full man overboard protocol. The crew announced over the intercom for all passengers to return to their cabins for verification. Some grumbled at the disruption. Others, having already heard whispers about a missing young woman, complied in tense silence. It took nearly an hour for staff to confirm the numbers. When they were finished, the result was as stark as it was chilling. Of more than 3,000 passengers, only one was unaccounted for, Chloe Martinez. The news spread quickly, carried in snippets of conversation and half-overheard exchanges between guests and crew. By evening, the ship's once vacationing passengers were gripped by a kind of collective paranoia. Rumors swirled in every lounge and dining hall. Some whispered that Chloe had been drunk and fallen overboard. Others speculated about foul play, an argument, a fight, or a predatory stranger on the ship. A few even questioned whether she might have staged her own disappearance. None of these theories felt grounded, but the not knowing, the lack of answers, was worse than any single explanation. Meanwhile, security teams reviewed the ship's surveillance footage, piecing together Chloe's final movements. Cameras captured her leaving the nightclub just after 1:15 a.m., her friends trailing behind but eventually heading in another direction. At 1:20 a.m., another camera spotted her on the way to the pool deck. She was barefoot, still holding her phone, her pace unsteady but purposeful, as though she knew where she was going. Then, nothing. She never reappeared on any exit camera. No footage showed her returning inside. It was as if she had walked out to the deck and then simply ceased to exist. When investigators overlaid the footage with her phone's last recorded ping at 1:32 a.m., it deepened the mystery. She'd been alive and moving around for at least 12 minutes after leaving the nightclub, but in that window, she disappeared without a trace. And there was no camera position to see what happened in the exact stretch of deck where she'd last been seen. That blind spot, they realized, could hold every answer they needed, and they had nothing. By late afternoon, ship security informed Chloe's friends that the search had yielded no results. The captain addressed passengers over the intercom, carefully stating that a guest had been reported missing and that the crew was working closely with authorities to investigate. He didn't use the phrase overboard, but the implication hung in the air. Some passengers quietly gathered on the upper decks, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean with a kind of horrified fascination, murmuring about how quickly the ship traveled and how hard it would be to spot anything in the water. One guest later told investigators that this was when the mood shifted completely. The realization that they weren't just dealing with a late sleeper or a drunk partygoer. They were dealing with someone who might be gone forever. For Chloe's friends, panic set in like a physical weight. They replayed the night over and over in their heads, wondering if they'd missed something, a clue in her tone, in the way she'd left the club, in the abruptness of her last social media post. They clung to hope that she was still somewhere on board, hiding, sleeping, or avoiding attention for reasons they couldn't yet understand. But as night fell and the search continued with no success, that hope began to thin. It was replaced by an unspoken fear that no one wanted to voice aloud. If Chloe wasn't on the ship anymore, and she wasn't answering her phone, then there was only one other possibility. And that possibility was too dark for them to say out loud. The hum of the ship's engines, normally a background comfort to passengers lulled into the rhythm of a carefree vacation, took on a different tone in the hours after Chloe was declared missing. They were no longer moving toward a destination. They were locked in place, suspended in a growing unease. The captain made the decision to halt normal operations and restrict movement across certain decks, a quiet lockdown that wasn't formally announced but quickly became obvious to everyone on board. Crew members, who just a day ago had been smiling and making small talk, now moved with a clipped efficiency, speaking in low voices and avoiding eye contact with guests. Security checkpoints appeared at access doors that had been freely opened before. It didn't feel like a floating resort anymore. It felt like an investigation scene, cut off from the world. By late morning, the captain had escalated the case. Authorities on shore were notified that a passenger was missing under suspicious circumstances. Because the cruise had departed from Florida, the FBI was alerted, but jurisdictional lines at sea are rarely simple. The ship, technically operating under a foreign flag and currently in international waters, didn't make it easy for federal agents to intervene. Red tape meant that even though the FBI was informed, their active involvement would be delayed until the ship reached port. Until then, the investigation belonged to the ship's security team, assisted by local maritime authorities who had only limited power. It left Chloe's friends with the unnerving feeling that the most critical hours of the search were slipping away in bureaucracy. In the meantime, Chloe's friends made sure the crew understood one thing clearly: Chloe hadn't been drunk enough to stumble overboard. They repeated it again and again, their voices growing sharper each time, as if saying it enough might break through the ship's staff's polite, measured reassurances. They described Chloe as the opposite of reckless, a woman who had been cautious, even borderline paranoid, about her safety. She had been open about her fears of being harassed, about the risks that came with her online fame, and about staying hyper-aware of her surroundings. She wasn't the type to lean over a railing in the middle of the night or wander off alone for the thrill of it. Whatever happened to her, they insisted, wasn't an accident. Ship security worked to map Chloe's movements leading up to her disappearance, but the process was slow and piecemeal. Surveillance cameras offered only fragments of the story: her leaving the nightclub, walking barefoot toward the pool deck, then disappearing into a section of the ship where coverage had been down for weeks due to maintenance. It was a blind spot in the most literal sense, one that suddenly carried devastating weight. Chloe's last moments on camera had been captured on her own phone, not the ship's. And her phone, the single device that might hold the missing pieces, had gone completely dark at 1:32 a.m., leaving investigators with little more than speculation. Passengers felt the tension build like a living thing. The hallways buzzed with theories. Some clung to the idea that Chloe had simply got lost or passed out somewhere no one had thought to search. Others whispered darker ideas, that she'd been taken, that she'd met someone who meant her harm. People noticed the way the crew avoided answering certain questions and their carefully rehearsed lines about ongoing searches and continuing to ensure passenger safety. It all made the absence of answers louder. And then, late that night, came a chilling detail that changed the tone of everything. While speaking quietly with Chloe's friends, one crew member admitted something unusual. Several of the ship's lifeboats had been found unlocked overnight. Technically, this wasn't unheard of. Emergency drills sometimes required them to remain accessible. But this hadn't been a drill day. There had been no scheduled reason for those lifeboats to be tampered with. The admission was brief, almost casual, as though the crew member hadn't fully processed what they were saying, but to Chloe's friends, it landed like a gut punch. Unlocked lifeboats meant one thing: someone had been on that deck, after hours, accessing areas of the ship that should have been secured. It raised questions no one wanted to answer. Had Chloe gone there willingly? Had she been forced? Was someone hiding on that deck with her? It introduced the possibility that she hadn't simply fallen. She might have been moved, placed somewhere, or worse, removed from the ship entirely. When her friends brought this detail to the ship's security team, they were met with restrained responses, careful not to confirm or deny too much. It wasn't clear whether the crew had already connected these dots or if this was new information to them, but their reactions made one thing certain: this wasn't a case they could dismiss as a passenger gone missing after a night of partying. This was bigger, more complex, and far more sinister than anyone had admitted out loud. As the hours dragged on, Chloe's friends sat huddled in her cabin, staring at her untouched belongings, her neatly folded clothes, her laptop, her cash and passport, trying to make sense of the impossible. She had walked barefoot to a pool deck at 1 a.m, and from there, she had ceased to exist. Somewhere in the middle of that vast, unblinking ocean, on a ship that was supposed to be safe, Chloe Martinez had vanished. And now, with locked doors and restricted decks cutting off the ship like a floating prison, one haunting truth began to settle in: if she hadn't left this vessel alive, then someone on board might know exactly what happened to her. By the second morning, whatever faint optimism had existed among Chloe's friends and the passengers who'd been whispering about her disappearance had hardened into something heavier. It no longer felt like a delay, or like she might walk into the dining hall with an apologetic grin, explaining that she'd needed space. It felt like something irreversible had happened. The cruise ship staff, trying to project calm, moved with a purpose that belied their reassurances. And then came the confirmation of what many had feared: the Coast Guard had been notified. By mid-morning, search planes were sweeping vast stretches of the Caribbean, tracing arcs in the endless water, looking for anything: a body, debris, a piece of clothing, that might explain what happened to Chloe. They found nothing. No floating handbag. No towel or shoe. Not even the smallest scrap of evidence to suggest she'd fallen into the sea. For Chloe's friends, that absence was maddening. If she'd gone overboard, there should be something.
The ocean, for all its immensity, rarely keeps its secrets so neatly. But this one did. On board, the search intensified. Every cabin that had not been previously inspected was opened, starting with unoccupied ones and working through rooms whose occupants were absent or volunteered access. Chloe's cabin, the one she'd shared with her friends, was ransacked again by security. The search turned up her cash, her passport, her laptop, and even her expensive jewelry tucked away in its case. Nothing appeared stolen. Her clothes were still neatly packed or hanging in the closet. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that she'd hastily prepared to leave. It was as though Chloe had walked away from her life and left everything behind, except her phone. That detail gnawed at investigators. For Chloe, her phone wasn't just a device, it was her livelihood. Her entire career revolved around being online, engaging with her followers, and posting updates. Yet the one thing missing from her cabin was the one thing she always kept close to her. It wasn't just misplaced. It was gone. Interviews with passengers and staff became the next focus. Investigators worked their way through Chloe's last known interactions, piecing together her night like a puzzle with missing edges. A bartender remembered her clearly. Chloe had been at the ship's nightclub late that night, laughing, drinking, but not appearing intoxicated. And then his memory sharpened. She had an argument. Not with her friends, not with anyone he recognized, but with a man. He couldn't recall the details of the dispute, only that it had been brief but intense, enough to draw his attention amid the noise and flashing lights. The man had followed her when she left. Chloe's friends were adamant. They didn't know anyone fitting that description. They hadn't seen Chloe arguing with anyone and hadn't noticed a stranger shadowing her as she made her way out of the club. When they were shown still frames from security footage, grainy images pulled from the cameras near the nightclub, they stared at the blurred outline of the man, trying to place him. They couldn't. He wasn't part of their group. They had never seen him on the ship before that night. That raised an unsettling question. Was this man another passenger? Or was he someone who shouldn't have been there at all? The idea that a stowaway or unauthorized person might be aboard seemed absurd at first. Cruise ships operate under layers of security, with crew and guest manifests meticulously checked. But gaps exist, and investigators knew it. Contractors boarded at ports. The crew rotated in and out. Visitors came aboard briefly for entertainment or maintenance duties. The flow of people was complex enough that someone with access, or someone willing to exploit vulnerabilities, could disappear into the fabric of the ship without drawing immediate attention. The thought that Chloe had encountered someone like that, a man unaccounted for on any manifest, sent a shiver through her friends. It would explain why no one could place him, why he didn't appear in their memories of previous days on board. It would explain why he seemed to follow her out of the nightclub and toward the pool deck, where cameras conveniently failed to capture the next moments. Yet even as investigators worked through these leads, Chloe's friends couldn't shake the memory of her demeanor on that last night. She hadn't seemed like herself, not entirely. Distracted, watchful, scanning rooms in a way that made them wonder if she'd been worried about someone before the argument even happened. Had she known this man before boarding? Or had he been someone who'd made himself known to her during the cruise? That uncertainty added another layer to an already suffocating mystery. Meanwhile, whispers among the passengers grew darker. Some were convinced Chloe had been targeted, that her online career made her vulnerable to obsession or worse. Others clung to simpler theories, suggesting she'd snuck off with someone willingly and met a tragic accident. But as investigators pored over the last pieces of available surveillance footage, one truth remained undeniable. Chloe had walked toward the pool deck at 1:20 a.m., followed closely by a man who wasn't part of her circle. 12 minutes later, her phone went dark. After that, she ceased to exist in any traceable way. And that begged the question no one could escape. If that man knew where Chloe went next, was he still on board, blending in among them as if nothing had happened? Or had he already found a way to vanish, taking with him the only person who could tell the truth about what happened in those final, unrecorded minutes of Chloe's life? When investigators finally gained access to Chloe's digital life, the gravity of what they found stripped away any lingering hope that this was a simple case of a young woman making a reckless decision. Chloe's phone itself had yet to be recovered, but her cloud accounts painted a chilling picture of her final moments. Buried in her messaging apps was a series of unsent or incomplete texts, as though she had been trying to communicate with someone but couldn't finish her thoughts. Most were fragments, half-written words, incomplete sentences, abruptly cut off as if something had interrupted her. One of them, time-stamped at 1:29 a.m., was only 2 words long, but it carried the kind of weight that stopped everyone in the room who read it. "He's here." No name. No explanation. Just those 2 words. And then nothing. To whom she had been writing those messages wasn't immediately clear. Her friends initially assumed she'd been trying to reach them, but none of them had received those texts. They hadn't appeared in their inboxes at all.
Investigators determined they had likely been typed but not sent, sitting as drafts on her phone before it disconnected or was powered off. That detail made the situation even more unnerving. Chloe had been actively trying to communicate with someone moments before she vanished, but for reasons unknown, she never completed the messages. And whoever he was, she clearly thought it important enough to note his presence. Her phone's last location ping deepened the unease. Data logs traced her final signal to a section of the ship far removed from the usual late-night activity. At 1:28 a.m., Chloe's device had been on the lifeboat deck, an area rarely accessed by passengers at any hour, let alone in the dead of night. Investigators familiar with the ship's layout knew that reaching that deck wasn't something you did by accident. It was secluded, tucked away from the nightclub scene and pool areas where Chloe had last been seen. To get their required purpose, a deliberate choice or a guided one. This revelation left Chloe's friends stunned. They couldn't fathom why she would go there alone. Chloe was cautious, even borderline paranoid, when it came to her safety. She avoided dimly lit areas, kept to populated spaces, and always texted someone if she was heading somewhere unfamiliar. Yet, for reasons they couldn't understand, she had walked straight into one of the quietest and least monitored sections of the entire ship. The implication gnawed at them. Had she gone willingly? Or had she been coerced? The next blow came when investigators cross-referenced that location data with the ship's security system. They discovered what they already suspected. There was no surveillance footage of the lifeboat deck that night. The cameras covering that section had been marked as under maintenance for weeks. In theory, this wasn't suspicious on its own. Ships regularly cycled through maintenance schedules. But paired with Chloe's disappearance, the timing was too precise to ignore. Cameras elsewhere were functioning as expected, capturing her leaving the nightclub and heading toward the pool deck. But the moment she entered the area with broken surveillance, she disappeared from every form of visual documentation. To Chloe's friends, this revelation didn't feel like coincidence. It felt deliberate, as if someone had taken advantage of the ship's blind spot. Investigators wrestled with the same thought. They couldn't yet prove it, but the convergence of broken cameras, a secluded deck, and a missing passenger who had typed "he's here" minutes before her phone went silent couldn't be written off as random chance. The search of her cloud data also revealed a series of browser searches from earlier in the trip that caught investigators' attention. Chloe had been looking up phrases like "how to report harassment on a cruise" and "what to do if you feel unsafe on board." She hadn't mentioned these fears to her friends, at least not in a way they recalled, but it became clear she had been unsettled long before that final night. Whether these searches were related to the man she'd argued with in the nightclub or to someone else entirely, they painted a troubling picture of her state of mind. Chloe hadn't been carefree on that cruise. She had been wary. For law enforcement, the lack of camera footage created a gaping hole in the timeline. They could map her last known movements up to the pool deck.
They could place her phone on the lifeboat deck minutes later. But from there, her trail evaporated. What happened in that 8-minute window between her leaving the nightclub area and her last phone ping was now the central question. Investigators began quietly asking crew members about access to the lifeboat deck. Was it truly open to passengers? Could someone have led Chloe there under false pretenses? Did any staff notice someone escorting her that way? The answers were inconsistent, with some claiming it was easy enough to reach, while others insisted it was an area most passengers wouldn't even know how to find. Her friends, now fully aware of these details, were consumed by a different question. If Chloe had been frightened enough to type "he's here," why hadn't she run? Why hadn't she sent the message? And who was he? Was it the man from the nightclub? Someone she already knew? Or someone she had only come to recognize as a threat too late? Those incomplete messages haunted everyone involved in the case. They weren't just drafts. They were snapshots of terror, moments of thought frozen in time by someone who may have been interrupted in the middle of a desperate attempt to reach out for help. And as investigators stared at the combination of broken cameras, a secluded deck, and an unidentified man from the nightclub, one question grew louder than all the rest. Had Chloe Martinez unknowingly walked straight into a trap? 2 days after Chloe disappeared, the ship finally reached San Juan. For most passengers, docking meant an end to the nightmare of being confined with fear and rumors, but for Chloe's friends, it only sharpened the pain. They were met by a team of FBI agents who boarded as soon as the gangway was secured. The arrival of federal authorities injected a new energy into the investigation, one that was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. If the FBI was involved, this wasn't being treated as an accident anymore. They weren't looking for a missing tourist. They were investigating a possible crime. Agents moved methodically, interviewing crew members, re-interviewing Chloe's friends, and issuing orders for a full, deck-by-deck search of the vessel. They weren't just sweeping for a body. They were looking for evidence. For hours, the ship felt frozen in time. Passengers were asked to remain in designated areas while agents and security personnel tore through every corner of the vessel. They opened storage closets, checked crew-only access points, and scoured restricted areas that hadn't been touched since the initial search. But it wasn't until mid-afternoon that one crew member, assigned to inspect lifeboats on the lower deck, found something that would change the entire course of the investigation. Inside one of the covered lifeboats, wedged into a space between the seating and the hull, lay Chloe's phone. The crew member who found it described the moment later as surreal. The phone wasn't broken, waterlogged, or damaged in any way. It hadn't been dropped accidentally into the boat, and it hadn't been lost at sea. It had been placed there, carefully, deliberately. Agents confirmed that detail almost immediately. This wasn't the phone of someone who had fallen overboard. This was a phone that had been intentionally hidden. When investigators accessed the device, the contents offered as many questions as answers. The draft messages they had seen in the cloud were still there, frozen in time exactly as they had been when Chloe typed them. But now, there was something new, something that hadn't been captured in the earlier data pools. The last thing Chloe's phone recorded before going dark was a photo. A single, blurry image taken at 1:31 a.m., seconds before her phone stopped transmitting. It showed a portion of the lifeboat deck, tilted at a strange angle, as though the phone had been raised quickly or Chloe had been holding it in a rush. The photo wasn't clear enough to show a face or a figure, but one thing stood out, the partial outline of someone standing near the edge of the frame. For investigators, that detail sent a jolt through the case. Chloe hadn't gone to the lifeboat deck to be alone. She wasn't there by accident. She was with someone. Whether she'd gone willingly or had been coerced, she'd been close enough to capture at least part of their presence in her final moments before the phone went silent. The placement of the phone raised even more disturbing questions. If Chloe had been harmed near that deck, why had her phone been left behind, and why had it been hidden instead of discarded? It wasn't tossed overboard, which would have made it nearly impossible to find. It wasn't smashed or destroyed, which suggested whoever placed it there didn't care if it was recovered. But it wasn't left in plain sight either. It was tucked away in a covered lifeboat, as though someone wanted to remove it from the scene but not eliminate it entirely. That act felt deliberate, even calculated. Chloe's friends couldn't stop themselves from replaying those details in their heads. They knew her habits. She didn't take random photos for no reason. If she'd snapped that last picture, she'd done it intentionally. Maybe she'd sensed something was wrong. Maybe she'd wanted proof of where she was and who she was with. But if she'd had time to take a photo, why hadn't she sent it? Why hadn't she called someone? Those questions twisted in their minds, leaving them tormented with the thought that she might have been seconds away from escaping, from telling someone what was happening, before she was silenced. For the FBI, the discovery reframed the entire narrative. Chloe hadn't simply vanished after leaving the nightclub. She'd gone to one of the most isolated areas of the ship and encountered someone there, someone she clearly recognized enough to type, "He's here." She'd taken a photo seconds before her phone went dark, and then that phone had been intentionally hidden in a place that would take days to find. Whether that someone was a passenger, a crew member, or an unauthorized individual, one thing had become undeniable. Chloe Martinez hadn't been alone in her final moments.